Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here this morning. We are happy to be here to share with you about our experience in August traveling to Atlanta with several stops along the way to attend a training at the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, Reconciliation, and Justice. There were 5 of us who went on this pilgrimage who are here to share with you this morning. And so we're going to take turns telling you a little bit about what our experience was like, what impacted us, and how our lives and ways of thinking and living have been transformed by our work in the Becoming Beloved community ministry together. And so I just want to start us off by giving a little bit of context. This Becoming Beloved community is a ministry of the Episcopal Church, which we have adopted here at St. Paul's. We've been meeting for about a year, a little longer than a year, and we spend time together reflecting on our own participation in race relations in our community and in the United States, and thinking about ways in which we might address dismantling racism in our lives and in our community. We are an open group. You're always invited to join us, and we'll have more information on an invitation at the end of our time together. And we're hoping to have enough time at the end to take questions and answers. So if you have questions, write them down, hold on to them, and we'll hopefully have some space at the end to address those. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic off to Jim.
Good morning. Am I on? There we go. So why did we go to Atlanta? The simple answer is we went to learn. Okay, as Samantha mentioned, we had formed this reading group, and through this reading, many of us woke to the idea that we continue to live in a system that is unfair and oppressive to many of our neighbors. And this runs counter to the teaching of Jesus and our baptismal vows. So we felt inspired to form this ministry to raise awareness in our church and to work in, join in the work of racial healing in our community. So the next step was, how do you accomplish that? It's hard to talk about racism. And so we knew that we thought it'd be worthwhile to see what other groups are doing and try to learn from them. We knew that many of the dioceses in the country had started to require clergy and vestry to complete anti-racism training, and we thought it would be important to learn about that training and see what it entailed and participate in that training. One such group that appealed to us was the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. The director was Dr. Catherine Meeks, who was a nationally recognized voice for racial healing. One of the books that we initially read that inspired us was Living into God's Dream, which I forgot to bring. It's a wonderful book, and we felt inspired by that writing. Several of us also had the chance to meet Dr. Meeks at the Arkansas Diocesan Convention, where she gave an incredibly moving presentation about the effects of racism and the courage that it takes to face it head-on in order to start the work of reconciliation. She also spoke of her childhood growing up in poverty in southern Arkansas. Her parents were sharecroppers, and the family endured terrible hardship. Despite this, she came to realize the life that God had dreamed for her. So we felt that Atlanta would be a good place to start, but we also knew it was popular and maybe difficult to get into the training. We weren't sure if we would be accepted as out-of-state participants. So when I called to inquire about the training, a nice lady answered the phone. I introduced myself and said I was with a group from St. Paul's from Fayetteville, Arkansas. And she replied, yes, I'm from Arkansas too. I grew up south of El Dorado, and I have many friends in Arkansas. And I was just in Little Rock. And I said, is this Dr. Meeks? And she said, yes, this is Catherine. And I was taken aback and told her I didn't expect to talk to the director of the program. She explained that the receptionist had to leave early because of a sick child, and she was manning the front desk. So we had a long conversation. She was pleased to hear about our group, and she then invited us to come to Atlanta to participate in their training. So after the phone call, I seriously wondered if I had been involved in some kind of divine intervention. We then planned to travel to Atlanta. Initially, I thought we should just fly there. It's very far away, and I didn't want to miss a lot of work. But as the air fare went up, and over time, our group decided to be better, more economical to drive there together as a group. Plus, we might see some interesting things along the way. Little then did I realize that the journey, would be one of the most meaningful parts of the experience. The trip was grounded in spirituality. We started and ended the day in prayer. We shared meaningful conversation and meals with each other. And slowly, I had the feeling that this was something very special. So I guess it also didn't hurt matters that my travel companions were exceptional women who included a social activist, an advocate for children, a chaplain, and a priest. And so I was in good company. And not to be outdone, I'd like to point out that I also had an important part of the group, and that included helping with the luggage. And so our journey began.
Hello? Okay. So our journey did begin. As we met here at St. Paul's and we loaded into the car together, we were hoping to arrive in Memphis in time to take in the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel. And we, depending on traffic, and if you've all been on that highway, you know what it's like to get there, but we did. We got there in time. And it was amazing to drive up to that site and see the spot that Dr. King was murdered. And hanging on the balcony is a wreath to commemorate that. So we were on this journey together, but just as Beloved Community had begun, as soon as we walked through those doors, we were on our own path again. We all started our journey through this museum at our own pace and taking it in as we needed to personally to understand our history and to understand the story and for our own growth. So we entered together, and it was this multi-sensory experience to be there. Visually, auditory, there were things to listen to, places to look, reenactment of events that took place during the Civil Rights Movement. In particular, a Greyhound bus was in there that showed what had happened during the Freedom Riders trying to move through and being attacked. A full-size bus, city bus, where Rosa Parks sat down. So we had these real experiences as we walked through there. And part of that showed the beginning with slavery. We walked into this one area, and we could see real life size of the way men and women were chained into the bottom of a ship to come to our country. Civil rights movement has been happening much longer than the 60s. And that's what came over me, that the history I knew growing up was sort of fed to me in a way that was palatable, but not necessarily the truth. So that was my journey as I walked through. And interestingly enough, we only had about an hour. So we got there in time, but we only had about an hour. And we all were taking our time and taking it in. And we kind of came together at one point, and the museum docent came over and said, we're closing in 5 minutes. We all nodded our agreement, kept our path, thinking we were almost there, because we'd been there for an hour already. And pretty soon he showed up again and was like, we're closing now. Let me walk with you. And we were only in the middle of the museum. Another turn, another path, another turn, another path. And he talked and he tried to give us as much information as he could. And we exited, and there was still another building to go into that was the place where the killer stood to look across through the window at that balcony. And so again, that multi-sensory being in that space and taking a moment to take in what really took place there. But as I left that place, I realized how we were in the middle of that museum, and we're still in the middle of this movement. Civil rights is still happening. We are in the middle of the movement, and now's the time for us all to be involved. After that, we took in the Rendezvous. If anybody's been to Memphis, you know that that is an iconic place to go and eat in Memphis. We had some celebrations on the trip. It was Samantha's birthday. We celebrated her birthday. But what was wonderful about being there at that point in time, and why it's important to this story, I think, is our waiter, Robert Jr., had been working there since 1948. And he was still part of the Rendezvous, right? So it was just this continuation of this story as we embarked on this together. So we had dinner there, and again, we loaded up into our car to continue our journey south in the dark, and that was the same day Aretha Franklin died. And we put her music on as we continued our journey, and it really was more than just going to Atlanta to learn. This really ended up being a spiritual pilgrimage as we went along, and it was amazing to be with this group of people to do that at the same time. So we went into the night listening to Aretha.
After spending the night, where were we? Holly Springs? No, where did we spend the night? After spending the night somewhere in Mississippi, I think, we made our way the next day to Alabama. If we had left the previous evening the iconic homestead, one of the iconic homesteads of the civil rights movement, we approached Alabama, which is one of the two largest slaveholding states by 1860. Nearly, very, very close to 1 out of 2 people living in Alabama had been brought there in chains on foot or by train or by ship, boat. So that's where we're headed. And when we arrived, and of all places, we were headed to Montgomery, which happened to be the capital of the domestic slave trade in Montgomery. Montgomery also, one of the things, walking around, it's a beautiful city. I'd never been there before, a beautiful city. And walking around, it is filled with, right there, yeah, all kinds of markers commemorating the Confederacy, commemorating and celebrating it. And in the midst of that place, in what once was a warehouse, not only for black prisoners awaiting the auction block, but they were crowded in with cattle and sheep and goats who also awaited their turn at auction. People were warehoused in despicable conditions. And on that site, in that location, the Equal Justice Initiative, founded by Bryan Stevenson. Many of you know him. He's a noted lawyer, activist, recognized as one of MacArthur's geniuses. He's also the writer. Some of us have read his novel Just Mercy. A community-wide reading here at the university, 2 years ago, was Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. In all the work he has done to reverse, and all the work he has done to address mass incarceration and the abuses of the justice system in regards especially to black people. In all that work, he came to believe that what we needed more than anything else was to tell the truth of slavery. The legacy of slavery was to describe it. He found that he learned more and more along the way, and that he thought the entire culture needed to be much more aware of the legacy of slavery, and hence this museum, which tells the story from slavery to mass incarceration at this point along the way. And when you go in, when we first stepped in, well, I want to say one thing. Unlike the Civil Rights Museum that we come from, this does not tell a comforting story. We didn't really, but the Civil Rights Museum, you could see the movement. And we could begin to participate in the movement, although we could tell how very early in it we still are. But there was a trajectory of empowerment and hope. The legacy of slavery doesn't comfort us in such a way as it describes the story of the progress from continually evolving ways of racial bias and persecution even into our own time. So when we first walk in, one of the things that grabs your attention is a quote by Maya Angelou. "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." It took courage, didn't it, to walk into that place and to continue moving through it, to bear witness to a reality that was just inconceivable, unimaginable on the scale of our lives. So here we are encountered right in the very beginning. As you walk in, there are grim statistics right in the very beginning, and the ones that really stayed with me are that in Montgomery at that time, there were more storefronts, more businesses for trafficking human beings, all of them black, more businesses set up to traffic human beings than the combination of all churches and all hotels totaled. Another fact that jumped out at me was that two out of 3 people living in Montgomery were enslaved. Think about the kind of power and oppression it takes to repress 2 out of 3 people in any one setting. Just begin to get a glimpse of how awful it is. And then as you move past these figures and past that quote, you go down a long, dark hall with these replicas of these slave pens set up. And as we are invited to approach each pen, we are invited because deep within the pen is sort of a haunting holograph of somebody speaking the narrative, the actual words that were handed down from people who lived in those warehouses, who went through this experience. So you draw close, and our own fingers are invited to grip the cage as we listen closely to one after another, some of them children, some of them old, all of them despairing and crying out, trying to find children who have been separated. It's appalling. And then we go down in, and we are led with all kinds of video and technology and research and beauty, really. We are led through a relentless yet riveting display showing us how once slavery had ended, it really continued in the form of convict leasing, convict labor. People were charged with all sorts of black people, minimal and ridiculous charges, things none of the rest of us would pay a penalty for, and yet they would spend the rest of their lives working off the fines that they could not afford. So that's where it began to go. It moved from slavery into convict leasing, from there into lynching. The legacy of lynching certainly grew exponentially following slavery. Slaves were too valuable to lynch on a whim, and this is recognized as a form of racial terror. Not only was the one lynched deceased, but more than that, a whole population were terrorized into participating in the system. And then from there, where did it move on from there? Let's see. The Jim Crow era, didn't it? The humiliations of living in the separate but equal Jim Crow area. And then once the civil rights came through and sort of blew that door wide open, just when we thought things were changing, and they are, that matters. But what we find is the mass incarceration. In the past 20 years, we have incarcerated as a nation more people than we had in our entire history up to 20 years ago. And blacks we incarcerate 5 times the rate we incarcerate whites. So you can see where what we think ended with slavery hasn't ended at all. And that's what, also one of the displays are just a wall, really a couple of walls lined with these jars where the earth had been, soil had been dug from beneath identifiable lynching sites. So beneath the tree or in the setting where someone had been lynched between 1877 and 1950. Look at that, that's Reconstruction through 1950. The soil was taken up as a memorial to those lives, some of them several lives. They're labeled with names and county and dates. Like I say, it's a relentless pace through a reality that some of us didn't have eyes for until we moved through there. And then finally, really, one of the stories that spoke to me through the eyes that Kathy McGregor has opened in the Prison Story Projects was we get to sit at a booth as if we were visiting a prisoner in a jail, in a prison somewhere, and there is a real video of a real falsely incarcerated, falsely charged and incarcerated African American who is on the other side of it. So you pick up, glass wall, you pick up your phone as if you are visiting, and then you listen to their story. That was gut-wrenching and powerful. So that's how we spent the early part of that afternoon. And then it got a lot harder.
Hi, I'm Janet. So we are intense on this journey. We moved a few miles, not even a mile, to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which just opened to the public in April of this year, of 2018. It's a memorial dedicated to the legacy of lynching. And it's very visual. The steel structures are behind us there. There are 800 of them. You're going to a funeral when you go. The weather was cooperating. It was raining on us. It was cloudy. And you start walking through this path of these 800 steel casket-like structures that are hanging from the ceiling. When you first enter, they're at eye level. And there are 800 of them because there are 800 counties where lynchings have been recorded. You try and kind of make a path, but you cannot. You cannot take it all in. I mean, you're reading names, you're reading dates, you're reading the same last name over and over on the same date, which means a family was lynched. You're reading a lot of unknown names because we don't have the person's name that was lynched. We just know there was 5. So as you walk through here, the structures start, there's more room to breathe, the lights coming in, and there's a spot to sit. It's just horrific. And does anybody know Arkansas history on lynching? Because our casket for Phillips County, Elaine, Arkansas, has the most names of anybody in the nation. There was a red summer in 1919. It's called Red Summer or Bloody Summer. It was lynching gone wild around the U.S., and Phillips County and Elaine had over 100 people of color lynched in one day. 242? Oh my gosh, I can't even. So we have a history. So at this point, we're still trying to walk, and we should be crawling and on our knees and just weeping. There's a water wall as you walk out. The images that I have, other than of course, the casket-like structures and just how many there are, Samantha was sitting looking at a quote on the wall, very still, and she was sitting right next to an African-American older woman with a walker. It's just a beautiful image. They're both kind of in communion, not speaking, but looking at a quote on the wall. And then I have an image of our Suzanne, who was at the water wall, and she was touching the water and obviously praying and just in deep, deep, deep grief and prayer. So there are moments of God there. Thank goodness for that. Anyway, none of us knew what we were doing when we started this. It just became incredibly intense. And as we get to the invite part, we will talk more about maybe getting a group of us to go do this together, because it's important to walk that.
So as we exited the memorial, we came across this statue, which is on the way out, of people with their hands up, a universal symbol that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And in a moment of grace and power, a rainbow appeared in the sky where we had been processing in the rain in a mournful way and still carrying that grief and sorrow, but seeing this symbol of hope, I think, was very powerful for many of us who were there. This ended our day of intensity. We drove the rest of the way to Atlanta to prepare for our full day training the following day. And so we attended a training. In the Diocese of Atlanta, it is required of all clergy people and of all new vestry members to participate in training for racial reconciliation, healing, and justice. And so there were about 30 people there. These are our trainers, the two women on either side of Suzanne. And we spent 8 hours with them talking about race and how that shows up in our lives and in our community. Because of the requirements in Atlanta, there were people there at the training who wanted to be there, and there were people who were there because they were required to be there, which made for an interesting dynamic when it came to time to start to have these sort of group reflection conversations. So throughout the day, we moved through a series of exercises, beginning the day with Eucharist, and then doing an exercise where we had to sit directly across from a stranger, someone who we had never met before, and we were invited to respond to a question. So the trainers would ask us a question like, when were you scared because of a racial element in the situation? Or when was the first time that you realized that race was present in your life? And so we would take turns sharing our answer and then listening to the answer of the person across from us, and then move down to another stranger to answer the next question. We also spent time doing an exercise where we had to decide. It was for the medical professionals in the room, it was a challenging exercise because we had to decide which of 6 patients, I think 6, to give a heart transplant to. And we only had a certain number of characteristics of each person, and it really unveiled for us the sort of bias that we carry when we are thinking about people. So for example, there was a young person who had a drug problem. Were they a more worthy candidate of someone who had found a cure for cancer but was a known white supremacist. So having to make decisions as a group with people who we had not met before was very challenging. Then we talked a little bit about implicit bias. We learned about privilege. We talked about other things having to do with racism. We spent the full day just immersed in these sort of conversations which were meant to spark critical thinking in ourselves. And one thing that really came up to the surface right away is that everyone in the room was at a different place on their journey of understanding, of nuance around race. And the beautiful thing that was that the space was held with a kind of grace where everyone was engaged as part of that conversation and called to growth and to look at how each of us might be able to continue in understanding our involvement in racism in a deeper way. So after that long day, we decompressed with some food at a restaurant called the Holy Taco, which we thought was appropriate. And then we made the long drive back the next day. And so that's a very quick sort of tour of our very quick pilgrimage. And I think now we'll take some questions, if folks have questions for us. And then we have just a few more minutes after the question time to invite you to think about how you might get involved with the work of this ministry of our church. So does anyone have a question?
Who developed the training for the racial reconciliation in Atlanta?
So the Episcopal Church developed a training in the 1990s called Seeing the Face of God in Each Other. And this is a training on racial reconciliation that's been used across the Episcopal Church since that time. The Diocese of Atlanta took that program and adapted it. And so this program comes out of that. And it has also been adapted for a youth program. So they have several different versions that they use, but it comes from the Episcopal Church's history of trying to address racism within our institution. So one of the important factors we took into consideration, because there's many places who offer anti-racism training, an important thing for us was that it be grounded in our faith. And so the training at the Absalom Jones Center is grounded in the sacraments, in our baptism, and so that was a very key element for us. Other questions?
I really have more of a comment than a question. The Elaine race riots, if anybody's interested in learning a lot about that, there's a book titled In the Laps of God, or In the Laps of God, and it is excruciatingly detailed historical account from not just the events on the ground, but the events in the country at the time, including Supreme Court decisions that helped kind of color the time and paint the context we were in. There's also recently constructed a memorial in Phillips. It's in Phillips County, but it's in Helena. And ironically, probably the biggest controversy with it is that it's in Helena and not Elaine. But that's just in the last few months. That's been placed there next to the courthouse, where a lot of the people who were detained, they were taken to that very courthouse, and it's just across the street from that. So I don't know the author's name, but the book is In the Laps of God. And you can find it easily.
In the labs.
Yeah, L-A-P-S.
Any other questions or comments, things that our sharing brought up for you?
Just another, just another book recommendation. There's a book that's just been released called The Sun Does Shine, and it's Brian Stevenson helped to get this man, this is in Alabama, off of death row, and I'm reading it right now as we've been touring across the state, and it's excruciating and hopeful all at the same time.
I'd like to make a comment, if I may, that it was a very difficult journey in so many ways, with terrific traveling companions, and under Samantha's leadership, grounded, as they said, in prayer. But I want to say that as grueling as it was to enter into an environment and to be awakened to the realities, therein actually is the hope. What's unnerving is that I think it's too soon to see the way out. Really? We can't see far ahead of us, but to be awakened to truth and to occupy the same reality with all of our brothers and sisters, that's gotta be the way forward, even if we can't see where we're going. So it filled us somehow it generated courage to be willing, not to take responsibility for the past so much, although there's some of that, but to be responsive to the forms in which racial bias continue now. To become responsive requires being woke, as they say. So I invite everyone else into this awakening journey. Back to you then, maybe you've got some ideas for us.
So our group is about a dozen people, and we get together every other week in the library following church on Wednesday night. And we have a vision for St. Paul's. We trust that our parish and our community will grow closer to the realization of Dr. King's dream for beloved community. We hope to be one source of leaven in that growth. Our group has identified that our priority is doing housekeeping. So looking at our own lives, at our own community, and thinking about the ways that we can start to dismantle racist ideas, our participation in racist systems, and to look for that new hope that is in Dr. King's vision and in Jesus' vision of the kingdom of God. We are grounded in our baptismal covenant, which you can see some of the statements up above. I think Janet had a few words that she wanted to share on that. Do you want to speak, Janet?
I just want to invite everybody to, I understand if you can't come to the meetings, we will be holding trainings here next year. You're welcome to come to those. Patty Williams is offering a book study on white fragility, which is something we've all found and read in the group because it gives us a good starting point. We can all talk the same language, but she's offering that in November. So this book is available today if you want to take it home with you, read it, pass it along to somebody else. We'll just do a great big community read. We should publish a book list, do you think? And thank you for your suggestions. That books that we're reading, that people can be reading. We are putting the did you know statements in the bulletin every week. If I get it to Megan in time, that's my job. You can just have a conversation over coffee at church about that statement. I mean, those are statements like Suzanne said, how many people of color are in jail compared to if your skin is white. It's the racial inequities. It's the factual statements of the racial inequities that we all have to look at. So there are going to be many ways to be involved, and we also want to form a spiritual pilgrimage to stop in Elaine County and maybe some of these other places, Alabama, Memphis, which would be fall of 2019. It'll be 100 years after the Elaine lynchings. So you're welcome to help us plan that. Think about going on that with us.
So our group on Wednesday night, we get together and we do some self-reflection, and then we put ourselves to the task of thinking about ways that we can engage the wider congregation. And so if you cannot make it on Wednesday night, do not feel discouraged, but know that we will be providing opportunities over the next 3 to 5 years for our community to do this work together. And so if you are free this Wednesday night at 7 p.m., we will be in the library, and you are invited to join us in, we're at the stage of visioning what those projects and offerings we want to bring to St. Paul's will be. And so you're invited to come and be a part of that visioning with us this Wednesday and into the future. And look forward to, part of our reason for going to Atlanta was to kind of suss out the training and think about how we might bring it to our community. So look for those opportunities when you see Becoming Beloved Community in the epistle or the communicant. Think about joining us and being a part of this transforming work in our community. Yeah.
I just want to add that Wednesday night coming together is a safe space, and talking about racism is hard, especially when we're white. Afraid of saying the wrong thing or embarrassing myself or sounding like I'm not very intelligent on what's going on. So I think that that's a great place to start a conversation, and our community of color needs white allies, and until we get comfortable talking about it, it's hard to be that white ally, to have a voice. So if just to come and listen initially, this is a safe place to come and start talking about racism, because it's hard.
So I'm sure we each have many more stories to tell, but it is also time to get headed to church if you're going at 11 o'clock. So feel free to come and speak to any of us now or whenever you see us next. Thank you.